I don't think I'd been Skinny Puppy with Ogre if it was based on friendship. I don't really see eye to eye with him all that much. He's always been on a different plateau to me. He's gone through his drug addiction and he's basically put the face of the band as the face of his lyrics, turmoil and troubles, when in actuality there's a wide variety of opinions going on in this band. While Skinny Puppy rightfully resides in the pantheon of industrial greats, the band never garnered the same success or cultural impact as some of their peers. Indeed, Skinny Puppy's influence, particularly in the 80s and 90s run of records, left an indelible mark on not just heavy and challenging music but the arts in general. Unfortunately, their demise in the 90s was one of the leading factors in why the band never quite cut through the mainstream membrane, despite riding high during the impetus of the scene's burgeoning popularity. So what caused the band's implosion in 1995 and subsequently stole their trajectory? Well, predictably, the first reason was internal strife within the band. The second factor to consider was their unwavering tenacity in wanting to deliver something challenging and different, which ultimately made their appeal extremely limiting and niche. Ironically, as the scene was getting more mainstream attention in the early to mid-90s, Skinny Puppy were in the throes of making the most challenging music of their career, before imploding in 1995 with the departure of Key and the death of Goettel. For me, I find this band fascinating. After making the fifth album, Rabies, the band went into a downward spiral and fell into a dark pocket of misery and turmoil, yet their work doesn't decline in quality. More surprisingly still, Skinny Puppy are making the best material of their career in spite of that fact. So with all that in mind, grab a coffee and fall down the rabbit hole with me as I take you through the self-destruction of Skinny Puppy between 1984 and 1996 and lay out where I think it all went wrong. 1984 to 1989. Live shows, Animal Rights and Al Jourgensen. After releasing a string of excellent records between 1984 and 1987, which by the latter half of the era was beginning to put a concerted effort into pushing experimental boundaries, by 1988 the band were really starting to find their stride, gaining a lot of momentum and interest in what they were doing. This was largely down to Skinny Puppy's infamous live performances, which were extravagantly grotesque and very theatrical, using a stage full of crude props such as crucifixes, an assortment of fleshy mannequins, blades, a bucket load of blood, and a very convincing performance that saw Ogre cutting his face open with blunt objects and rusty blades, and encasing it in this incredibly bleak, decaying industrial aesthetic. If you watch their live recording Ain't It Dead Yet, a performance recorded in Toronto, Canada 1987, you can bear witness to something not all that common at the time. Their stage show was a spectacle of suffering, horror and gore, which had a lasting resonance on bands like Rammstein, who would go on to emulate these kinds of visual and theatrical cues a decade later. These elaborate stage productions would grow more ambitious and realistic as time went on, and by 1988, after the release of their fourth album, Vivisect 6, a record which took a stance against vivisections and other animal rights issues, something Ogre was very passionate about, they would perfect the art so convincingly they had the police on their back after a show in Cincinnati, Ohio, after an observer called the police because they thought Ogre was performing a real-life vivisection on a dog. The dog was actually a prop used onto it called Chud. By 1989, Skinny Puppy were making real waves with their live shows and music. Vivisect 6's single, Testure, in particular really helped their profile. Designed as an accessible radio hit to draw greater awareness to vivisections and their stance on animal rights. The gambit paid off too, landing the song at number 19 on the Hot Dance Music Billboard chart. However, by the late 80s, things were really starting to get more turbulent in the band, largely stemming from Ministry main man Al Jourgensen. From what I've been able to gather from the timeline between 1987 and 1989, Key and Goettel were involved in various side projects, including Hilt, Downton Thomas and the Tear Garden. But while the two were doing other things, Ogre ended up hitting it off with Jourgensen during a short-lived side project called PTP, which was comprised of various Wax Trax Records artists. Nothing particularly noteworthy came from PTP other than the single called Show Me Your Spine, which was featured in the 1987 classic movie Robocop. But Ogre and Jourgensen formed a budding friendship out of it, and by 1988, Ogre was out on tour with Ministry, promoting The Land of Rape and Honey. However, despite the healthy creative freedom Skinny Puppy's members were enjoying during this time, it would ultimately plant seeds for a wider schism over the next half-decade, starting with Skinny Puppy's next album, Rabies. 1989 to 1990. Rabies, drug addiction and side projects. For me, I appreciate the importance of Rabies and the experiences that come from that album, as I don't think it would have allowed them to create the next two records in the same way. But it's impossible to look at Rabies as anything other than a flawed experiment. Jourgensen would co-produce with a long-time collaborator Dave Rave Ogilvy, as well as play some guitar on tracks like Fascist, Jock Itch and Tin Omen. But my biggest problem with Rabies is that while the music was pre-written with Jourgensen in mind before he actually got involved, the cross-pollination and subliminal influence strips away the inimitable allure and atmosphere of Skinny Puppy's revered sound. With the exception of Warlock and the ambient aspects of River, which foretell what's to come in the future, the rest of the album is more of a jarring mix of Skinny Puppy and Ministry, using the same sampling and guitar styles as Jourgensen's Day Job, which has pernicious effects on the band's soundscape overall. The songwriting isn't very strong either, and the dilution of the band's unique style to make way for a personality as big as Ministry's frontman doesn't present a very appealing body of songs. More telling still is outside of my overall feelings for the record, it appears Jourgensen's involvement with Skinny Puppy deeply affected the dynamic, introducing a poison that would eventually gas out the band in a few years' time. Al's appetite for heroin had a tremendous effect on Ogre during this period as well, as he began to familiarise himself with the drug, and tensions within the band were exacerbated further when Ogre decided to drop any promotion for Rabies in favour of touring with Ministry to promote The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste. Couple that with Ogre joining a side project with Jourgensen called Revolting Cocks to contribute to their sophomore album Steers, Beers and Queers, and the divide within the band will grow even further. This tension was reciprocated by Key and Goettel as they continued their own side projects, while Ogre was doing his stuff on the side. The unaddressed issue was that, in Goettel's opinion, everyone felt more satisfied with doing things outside of Skinny Puppy. Quote, "We weren't doing the tour to promote Rabies, we weren't supporting the album. Ogre was in Chicago satisfying a lot of things that weren't being satisfied in Vancouver or in Puppy, and obviously Kevin and myself were satisfying a lot of things we wanted to do. Just the fact that there was so much satisfaction coming from outside Skinny Puppy led to that feeling of the end." Nevertheless, Goettel and Key's resentment towards Ogre would fester over the coming years, accusing Ogre of focusing more on projects outside of Skinny Puppy, with Key dropping various comments in interviews where he said it felt like a wife that's been cheated on. This indictment would hold weight too when you consider that during the Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste tour, Ogre very nearly became an official member of Ministry. In his words, quote, "There were possibilities of me joining Ministry, but I didn't have a very good time on that tour. I was a fucking great guy, a really cool person. There are things that I admire about him, a lot. But there were a few things that happened between me and him that really made me question our whole friendship and his reason for having me down there. So I decided to bow out of the Revolting Cocks tour. If I hadn't, I would have come back totally addicted to heroin." 1990 to 1991. Too Dark Park and Pigface. With the involvement of Al in the Puppy camp in 1989 and all that transpired in between the development of Rabies and the subsequent focus on stuff outside of Skinny Puppy, as well as Ogre's growing drug addiction problems, there was understandably a palpable atmosphere in the camp. However, after what happened between Al and Ogre during the Ministry tour, Ogre stepping away from Jourgensen allowed Skinny Puppy to go back into the studio and back to the drawing board to re-evaluate their position on what makes the quintessential Skinny Puppy sound and how they could evolve it. As such, Too Dark Park is a watershed moment in the band's career and arguably the band's crowning achievement. In Alternative Press number 33, Key said Too Dark Park was the true successor to what he referred to as Skinny Puppy's last pure Skinny Puppy album, Vivisex 6. It's hard to argue with his sentiment either. The band's 6th LP is an unapologetic blend of their signature industrial sounds with a crushingly abrasive attitude being poured over it. It's a mixture that reintroduces their beloved atmosphere but successfully integrates the harder, darker, heavier approaches Rabies failed to achieve. Indeed, with a level of introspection, Key realised the path they were going down sonically was a bleak one, hence the album's title, a dual reference which also refers to Stanley Park, a place Key talked about in his YouTube deep dive video Sunday Live Chat, The Story of Two Dark Park, where he mentions Stanley Park having a storied history with the band and a place that is spiritually ominous and haunted. Two Dark Park is a seminal classic touching on concepts of humanity's own self-destruction and environmental degradation, the linchpins of the record, while the sonic playground it walks on is, as Key describes to Post TV in 1990, really dark. Key expands further, quote, Two Dark Park was a regrouping of the original incentives we had at the beginning of the band's inception. The processes and the directions were largely a return to the Skinny Puppy process versus what we had experienced through Rabies and the disattached feeling to the music we were making. So Two Dark Park is a cleansing of the soul and a return to a purer condition for Skinny Puppy. It's amazing to me that during the height of Ogre's drug addiction and the mounting rift between Goettel and Key versus Ogre, the band were able to reinvent the wheel and craft such a seminal work. Their tour promoting the record was also a big success, with Ogre reciting it as a highlight in his career. Their stage performances from this time ramped up the theatrics to 11, with the band pushing the audience to the limit using the infamous Japanese snuff series Guinea Pig as a visual backdrop, while Ogre roamed around the stage on stilts and pneumatic crutches, something Marilyn Manson would adopt in his live shows 6 years later. The setup was an experiment to see how people would react to such visceral imagery as opposed to something that had up until this point been staged. In an interview with RIP magazine in 1992, Ogre reveals, quote, We did an experiment. We've always been accused of celebrating violence for idiotic reasons, so we used some images in our show from a film called Guinea Pig. They are these incredibly realistic but simulated Japanese snuff films. We inserted them into this roller coaster ride of violent images and people were quite disgusted. People were vomiting in front of stage. People came up to me after the show saying I was the most disgusting human being until they found out what it was all about. The whole reason we did that was to see if there was a difference. Will people react differently to something that's real as opposed to something they know is staged? They will. There's a whole different set of emotions people go through. It doesn't look like that on TV. It's quite sickening. 1991 to 1992. Last Rites. After the completion of Two Dark Park for a brief spell in 1991, Ogre joined supergroup Pigface, taking on the role of lead singer. It was during this time Ogre was also focused on getting off heroin. In an interview with CRTR-FM, he talked about how he contracted hepatitis A and was hospitalised from it, having the support from Pigface to get him through his hour of need. In his YouTube video Sunday Live Chat, The Story of Last Rite, Key talks about the intensity of the Two Dark Park tour and how for the first time in his career he was so overwhelmed he had to walk away from it, frequently seeing his girlfriend in Florida and wearing bright coloured clothing in an attempt to relieve himself from the horror and intensity of the tour. After the tour, Skinny Puppy set out to make their 7th studio album Last Rites, and as Key puts it in his Sunday Live Chat, quote, When we got on the road, to go through that whole experience and then to go through the ordeal of making an album based upon what you just experienced, I think the experience of making Last Rites was a completely natural progression to what everyone was feeling. It was a complete expulsion of emotions. I know that it was a dark period for Ogre, and there were times during the Two Dark Park and Last Rites tours where we were in complete separation from each other. Unsurprisingly, the making of Last Rites was intense, with Goettel and Key composing the music during the day and Ogre under the supervision of Dave Rave laying down the vocal tracks at night. However, despite the difficulty in producing such a record, Last Rites is lauded as being one of the greatest industrial albums ever made. It is a very challenging record to get into, but the intricate density makes it a worthwhile experience if you're willing to put in the effort to listen to it more than a handful of times. It's an extremely flammable portion synthesised by a trio sitting on a cliff's edge. Nine Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral has a similar threaded narrative of the descent into madness, though Last Rites takes this mantra to another solar system 2 years prior. The introduction of Love in Vain begins the descent into the blackened void, with the subsequent 5 tracks operating on the same relatively conventional line, in the sense that they hold some semblance of structure and melody to them. Yet make no mistake, the term conventional here feels a bit misleading, since even these tracks have an unhinged aura about them. However, once you get to the second half of the LP, they go into like endorphin release and NSYNC pop bangers, next to the likes of Lust Chance, Circus Stance and Download, where all bets are truly off. It's indicative of where the band's headspace was at, a reflection of the utter communication failure and the chaos going on around them, a soundtrack wrought by addiction and a lack of interest in resolving the glaring elephant in the room. And that's what makes this album so special. That weaving narrative that underpins Last Rites is nothing short of genius. It's a complex web of atonal anguish, a cacophonous cocktail of borderless tracks with start and stop time being the only thing reining it in. I managed to find an original copy of this a couple of years ago, and I always wondered why track 10 was blank on the B-side of the record. It turns out track 10, titled Left Hand Shake, was omitted from the track listing due to a copyright dispute regarding a vocal sample from Timothy Leary's Turn On, Tune In, Drop Out. While Mr. Leary approved it, it was denied by the copyright holder. The track in question slots right into the second half of the album, a nightmarish fever dream with driving drums and gasping vocals from Ogre. As Ogre coined it to Mike Gitter from RIP magazine in 1992, the album is a document of delusion that captures the apex of the worst, most painful moments of his life. Last Rites audibly picks up on Ogre's suffering throughout, even commenting in interviews that he was having hallucinations while he was recording. This record literally has Ogre pouring his soul into the music, which is why the lyrics were never put to print on the liner notes. The irony here is that in spite of the bleak subject matter and hellish soundscapes, and the fact this is bar none the hardest Puppy album to get into, the album still managed to hit 193 on the Billboard 200, as well as peaking at 10 on the Billboard's Heatseeker chart. 1993 to 1996. The Process, Goettel's death, and Skinny Puppy's breakup. After finishing work on their 1992 masterpiece, Skinny Puppy had reached the end of their record contract with Network, signing a new 3-album deal with America Recordings. While things were looking optimistic for the band moving to sunny Malibu to record their 8th studio album, the entire endeavour would prove to be a bitter final reckoning for this iteration of the band. Put bluntly, outside of the internal tensions, the process was met with a freakish amount of turmoil. Mother Nature played an integral part in this record's tumult, hurling all elements of the band during recording. The studio they were recording in burnt down by wildfires, they were hit by severe floods, and it was finally all topped off by the Northridge earthquake in 1994. If that wasn't bad enough, declining relationships within the band were at a fever pitch, with Key and Ogre at each other's throats that much they stopped talking to each other entirely. The band went through a number of producers during the course of recording, starting off with Rolly Moserman, who was then replaced by Pigface's Martin Atkins, before desperately bringing in Rave to help them out. The process, no pun intended, was wrought by such troubles, stretching on for so long and costing so much money, America Recordings decided to alter the record deal from 3 albums to just 1, subsequently dropping them from the label once the process was released. When the album was finally cobbled together in 1994, Goettel and Key flew back to Vancouver with the masters while Ogre remained in LA. Relations were so bad in the camp that in June 1995, Ogre quit the band entirely, followed by Goettel's death in August of that year. Dwayne Goettel had fallen prey to heroin and died of a drug overdose at his parents' house. After the death of Goettel, Key and Rave got together and finished the album, dedicating it to Goettel and releasing it on the 27th of February 1996 to a mixed reception. For me personally, while I quite like the oppressive tone, it's clear as day that the songs were unfinished. Ironically, stylistically, the album feels like a regression to the Rabies era, relying heavily on razor-sharp chugging guitars, only with a dance-orientated flair to them. Ogre takes on a different approach vocally as well, using a spoken word style, which for me mostly doesn't work. The album was supposed to be a concept on Process Church of the Final Judgment, which Charles Manson was believed to have ties with, but again, like everything here, it all feels rather undercooked. The final conclusion to this 12-year span in history is a rather dreary and whimpering way for such an influential act to go out. I personally believe, listening to and reading various interviews for this essay, the main reason the band went out the way they did was because of a lack of communication and wanting to address the issue within the band. What I find most strange and interesting about Key and Ogre's relationship in particular is they both knew what the problems were, but never addressed the issues at hand, just accepted them as part of the package and tried to press on as best they could. Goettel's death is a deeply sad end to a very talented musician, and I honestly believe that while Skinny Puppy's reunion albums are solid enough, they lack the spark Goettel brought to the 1987-1992 run of records. I hope you enjoyed this video on Skinny Puppy's history. It's a bit of a strange one. I didn't do it in the conventional sense where it goes from the start of a band's career to the end. I thought I'd just do it in between a period, which I found most interesting. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. The primary reason for this channel is to bring awareness to the Sputnik Music website itself. So if you're interested in finding new music or just looking into your favourite bands, then just head over to www.sputnikmusic.com. And thanks again.